Sometimes players don't realize how good a Pokemon truly is until many years of metagame development have taken place. Older generations of Pokemon have been around for many years and continue to evolve and shift even to this day. The Pokemon and strategies that were popular when those generations were current often end up completely different years down the line, and sometimes Pokemon that were initially overlooked and rarely seen in competitive play become popular or even top tier choices. Let's take a look at some examples of competitive Pokemon that were ahead of their time, only rising to prominence years after their generation was current. But first, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to help us rally more support for the Mudcargo Alliance, who are currently at a disadvantage in the Horse Council civil war. All of these Jimothy non-subscribers pictured here are currently being shunned by the greater community for refusing to show their support in this trying time. Don't be like them. Thank you. Charizard is a staple of the modern Gen 3 OU metagame and a commonly seen Pokemon in tournaments, but this wasn't always the case, and Charizard was not always ranked in OU. Gen 3 works a little bit differently with its tiering. It's not usage-based. When Generation 3 was current, it actually predated the Smogon usage-based tiering system. So in Gen 3, Pokemon are tiered based on their perceived viability and the public perception of the Pokemon from the greater community. Charizard's rise to OU happened in February of 2022, not too long ago. For a very long time, Charizard was not considered very good and was not very popular. It does not have particularly strong stats, it is frail, and it had significant competition from Pokemon like Zapdos or Salamence that are offensive threats who provide a bit more to teams most of the time. But there was a player named Undisputed who saw potential in Charizard and its unique offensive tools, building a team with the combination of Charizard and Breloom on it. Undisputed had significant tournament and ladder success with this team, and the team caught the eye of just about everybody in the community at the time. This is a mixed offense team, meaning it does not use spikes to make progress against the enemy, and it doesn't use mechanics like trapping to set up for boost sweepers. Mixed offense teams aim to threaten a very wide array of Pokemon all at once with their offensive threats, and Charizard has the unique ability to do exactly that. Charizard can use the Fire Grass coverage combination to hit a pretty wide array of enemy types. But the real thing that rounds out Charizard as a mixed threat is its access to Focus Punch. With Focus Punch, Charizard has a way to punish Blissey, the #1 counter to special attackers in this format. Charizard will commonly use Substitute to give it a safety net to use Focus Punch on the incoming Blissey switch. Charizard has similar traits to Salamence as a mixed threat. Mixed Salamence sets commonly use Fire, Grass, and Fighting coverage as well, but Salamence does not have a stab boost on its fire moves and deals significantly less damage than Charizard can. Salamence also doesn't have access to Focus Punch. Brick Break may be a safer move overall, directly attacking whatever's in front of you, but Focus Punch can achieve much more damage. Charizard is a rare special attacker in Gen 3 OU that can significantly threaten every common special wall. Snorlax is also vulnerable to that sub-punch combo. Celebi and Jirachi are sometimes used in a specially defensive role, and they are weak to Stab Fire Blast. And if you see an off-meta special wall like a Regice is weak to Stab Fire and Focus Punch. Undisputed showed the world that Charizard has this unique place in the metagame as an offensive threat that doesn't need as much support as others, because it has all the tools to threaten just about everything in the metagame. Undisputed even used Dragon Claw on his set to deal super effective damage to Salamence and Flygon for even more coverage. And another option Charizard has to threaten Blissey in particular is Beat Up. In Gen 3, Beat Up is very unique. It is actually a typeless physical attack that deals damage based on base stats alone. It doesn't take into account EVs or natures in its damage calculation. So for that reason, you can completely bypass any defense investment that Blissey has and attack it purely based on its base defense, which is extremely low. Therefore, Beat Up will deal a huge amount of damage to Blissey in particular. And Beat Up has the advantage of being able to directly threaten Blissey rather than relying on the more prediction-heavy Focus Punch, if you prefer that option. The community at large re-evaluated Charizard after seeing its success and found it to be quite good even on Spike's teams. And after enough time passed, people understood that this was not just a fad. Charizard really is this good. It really does deserve its place in the metagame. Charizard was granted OU status. After all these years sitting in UUBL, Charizard became a part of OU once and for all. And even today, Charizard's relevance has endured. It is still a commonly seen Pokemon in tournaments. But I think an even more significant success story than this Charizard resurgence was Gen 4's Clefable renaissance. Unlike Gen 3, Gen 4 is a metagame where the tiering is set in stone. It is frozen in time, and the stuff that was ranked OU by usage back when the gen was current is still the OU list today. Many of those Pokemon that were popular back then don't even see much tournament use at all anymore. And a weird quirk of that system is that Clefable here, who is currently ranked UU officially, is actually a top tier Pokemon. Not just a good Pokemon in OU, well above its UU position. Take a look at the viability rankings for OU, which are recent. Clefable is the 4th best Pokemon in the entire metagame, outranking such threats as Heatran, Breloom, Metagross, Flygon, Dragonite. The list goes on. Clefable is this high despite being a UU Pokemon. I think this is the most significant example of a Pokemon rising well above their perceived viability many years later. So how on earth is this possible? Why did people lack respect for Clefable to such an extent when Gen 4 was current and even for quite a long time following that? And why now is Clefable considered so good in the metagame? A trend that we've seen across many different metagames in Pokemon history is that early on, offensive teams are more prominent. Offensive teams are more straightforward to build and to use than defensive teams are. But over time, the opposite happens. More balanced defensive teams rise in prominence. They are more consistent. They can make progress with mechanics like status and hazards, which is safe and has a good risk-reward associated with it and stuff like that. That's not to say that offense is an unviable strategy at certain points, but metagames do trend in favor of more defensive teams over time, but they take longer to build and to arrive at and to optimize. And Clefable is kind of the perfect Pokemon to rise alongside this metagame trend. Not only is it a good response to enemy teams with a more defensive strategy because of its ability Magic Guard, which is an outstanding ability that grants a complete immunity to all indirect damage. That includes Sandstorm chip damage, status damage, hazard damage, everything. It's an amazing ability to this day. Clefable was the first Pokemon to get this ability. This is a great response to teams that aim to stack hazards, rely on status to wear down opponents, and even use Sandstorm chip damage to their advantage in that regard. And it fits very well on those very same balanced teams because of its fantastic defensive move pool. It has reliable healing. It has knockoff to get rid of enemy leftovers and other crucial items on certain targets. It has support moves like Wish, Thunder Wave, Encore, Toxic. You can even run Calm Mind to Clefable, use it as an alternative win condition. Despite having poor stats overall, the sheer power of the ability Magic Guard and all of the immunity and consistency that Magic Guard offers were just supremely valuable. Not only as a response to the metagame trend that favored more defensive balancey teams, but also being a fantastic member of those teams itself. Clefable is one of the most consistent Pokemon in the Gen 4 OU metagame, completely sidestepping many of the common ways that teams aim to make progress and win. Another thing that happened that was quite interesting was that when Gen 6 released, Clefable became a fairy type instead of a normal type, and with that change, it saw a significant rise in popularity in the competitive singles format of OU, and became one of the best Pokemon. And I think that because people had Clefable on the mind at that time, they reevaluated in the previous gens. And in Gen 4 in particular, they tried it out and realized that actually it can function in much the same way and provide many of the same advantages to teams thanks to Magic Guard, even with the inferior typing of just normal. As people have gotten better at Pokemon over the years, and as more generations have come out, they have returned to Gen 4 with a modern mindset and all this new knowledge and all this years of development, and that has resulted in a very different experience and a different set of Pokemon that are viable and unviable. And I do think this is the most significant rise in a Pokemon over time in any metagame. It has to be. Clefable is outstanding in Gen 4 OU, and back when it was current, nobody really used the Pokemon much at all. If you want a more in-depth look into this particular topic of Clefable's rise and the history of the metagame that led to that point, check out this video by BKC that goes over this very topic. And this right here is one of my favorite competitive Pokemon stories, the rise of Cofagrigus in Generation 6 OU. This Pokemon is officially ranked RU. At the time, nobody was using this thing. But in the modern metagame, Cofagrigus is a popular choice. I think it probably deserves an OU rank. In a world where there aren't that many good bulky ghost types, Cofagrigus fills a very important niche. Not only as a spin blocker, an all-purpose defensive check to many things, but a counter to Pokemon that rely too heavily on their abilities for their damage output. One example of a Pokemon like this is Azumarill, who has the ability Huge Power, doubling its attack. Azumarill relies entirely on this ability for all of its damage output, but Cofagrigus has the ability Mummy. If you make contact with the coffin, your ability will be changed to Mummy, basically erasing your previous ability with a useless one. So if you switch in on an Azumarill, you completely cut their damage output. Cofagrigus also has useful application against Lopunny, Mega Lopunny, who has the ability Scrappy. This is an ability that allows normal and fighting type attacks to hit ghosts, but once Cofagrigus gets hit with a single attack, Lopunny loses that crucial ability and can't hit the coffin anymore. I really love this ability design. I think it is a really cool way to punish specific targets, and it has surprisingly common applications in the Gen 6 OU metagame against a lot of the most popular offensive Pokemon that you're going to see. Cofagrigus also has access to Toxic Spikes, giving it a utility move to click on its defensive switch-ins to make permanent progress against the enemy, enhancing a balanced game plan, which of course is a archetype that tends to rise over time. And Cofagrigus can also block certain enemies from using Rapid Spin because it's a ghost type. That's always useful. Gen 6 did introduce the new Defog, which was a new form of hazard removal that was not blocked by ghost types, but a lot of the most common hazard removers are still Rapid Spinners like Excadrill in this generation. So being able to block Rapid Spin still does have its uses. As for why it took so long to realize all the fantastic advantages of this Pokemon in Gen 6 OU, I think a big part of it was that at one point, Mega Sableye was completely outclassing all of this utility that Cofagrigus had as a superior bulky ghost type. Despite requiring the commitment of your 1 per team Mega Stone to use this Pokemon, it was well worth it. Mega Sableye has the ability Magic Bounce, which has so many powerful applications, bouncing hazards back and granting an effective immunity to status. Sableye has reliable recovery, status options foul play for sweepers. This is a rare instance of a defensive Pokemon that was too overwhelming and difficult to handle in a metagame getting banned. Usually, the Pokemon that get banned in singles are dominant offensive threats. This is the rare instance of a defensive Pokemon being too much for a metagame. So while Mega Sableye was allowed, there wasn't too much reason to use Cofagrigus. But once Mega Sableye was banned, there was a new gap in the market for a bulky ghost type to fill, and the Coffin had enough advantages to become the new premier defensive ghost type in the Gen 6 metagame, which is a really cool title to have for a formerly RU ranked Pokemon. It took a while for people to realize its strengths, but it did get its credit eventually. And people who play the Gen 6 OU metagame today have to respect Cofagrigus. It has earned its spot as a valid member of this format's modern landscape. And that does it for my 3 little examples of competitive Pokemon that were ahead of their time, that took years and years for people to realize just how good they really were. Who is your favorite example of a Pokemon that rose in viability over the years? Is it one that I talked about in this video or a different example? Let me know down below in the comments, and thank you for watching.